Okay, we want to talk about two things. First is give you a model of how you make decisions and what's involved in it. And it's a model that comes out of cybernetics, which we're going to be talking more and more about. And so basically, the other day we said the building blocks are our representational systems, things we see, hear, smell, taste, feel, and things that we convert into meaning. And so in all decisions, there are certain challenges that are systemic to the process, and being aware of them and where you run into the challenges is a big help. So the first thing is the trigger. Up to a certain point, you're not involved in making a decision, like the decision to come to this seminar. You didn't even know about it. And at a certain point, something triggered the process. You saw something, you heard something, you got something in the mail, somebody called you up and said, "Are you going?" Something started the whole process. Now then, let's take a typical example of buying strategy. So let's say you want to buy a car. Up to a certain moment, you're not engaged in car buying behavior. And then something happens. It maybe you look at it and go, "What a piece of junk." Or maybe you turn the ignition, you hear, and you realize you're going to be engaged in car buying behavior. Now, the next thing is the operation. Okay, so the first thing, too, on the trigger, there are two problems. One is that people procrastinate. They keep putting off making the decision. They keep delaying. Frequently, things are overcome by events because they don't act. The other opposite is that they've got a hair trigger. They're always making decisions before they need to. They're always jumping ahead. My wife has an annoying habit to me of asking me, "Well, what do you want to eat tomorrow?" And I'm going, "I haven't even got through today. I'm not even thinking about it. I'll decide tomorrow. Ask me at that point. Maybe I can know, but I'm not ready to make that decision now." So anyway, so some people jump in ahead and some people delay. And so part of the secret is finding the right instant to start the process. Okay, next is the operation. Now, the operation is one of the most critical parts. And in the operation, then we do two things. We generate alternatives to evaluate, and we collect data about them. So there's several problems here. One is frequently we've only got one alternative. We've only got one alternative. So it's not a question of if, it's only a question of when. It's a go, no go. It's a default. Not good. The second thing is we got, and more common, we got two alternatives and neither one of them is very good. This is called a dilemma. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. And we're stuck. So what do we need? We need at least three good alternatives. We need at least three good alternatives. And good means that any one of them would be acceptable and would be an improvement on the current situation. So we need three good alternatives. Now then, once again, there's problems here. As we said, people either have one, which therefore is go, no go. They've got two bad ones, which is a dilemma. They've got three good ones. And there's some people that just keep generating alternatives and they can never get around to deciding. It's like they go to dinner, they pick up the menu, the first thing looks good. Yeah, that looks good, that looks good. They go through the whole menu, everything looks good. They go back through it and they just keep going and they can't make a decision because they go on and keep generating possibilities. Next is collecting data about the possibilities. So that we need to be able to see, hear, smell, taste, touch, sense, understand the different alternatives in order to evaluate them. And frequently people make decisions on irrelevant criteria. So if you're going to buy a car, most people buy cars because they look right, because they feel right. There are a few weird people that buy cars because they sound right or because they make sense. And we scratch our heads and we go, how could anybody do that? I had a seminar where I had a guy from Detroit. He needed to buy a new car. He decided it had to have two characteristics. It needed to be made in Detroit and it needed to be a diesel. So he calls up and he finds out there's only one company in Detroit that makes cars that are diesels. And he calls up and they said, we have two models. And he said, which is the cheapest? And they said, this one. And he said, good, do you have one? And they said, well, certainly, we make them. And he said, well, could I come down and pick it up this afternoon? And they said, don't you want to see it? And he said, no. They said, what color? He said, irrelevant. And they said, don't you want to drive it? And he said no. And he was purely going on his intellectual thing of these two criteria. And everybody in the room was going, this guy is weird. Another guy bought a car on the basis of sound. It was like, which car had the best stereo system? He goes in the car, he doesn't want to drive it. He goes in, he turns on the stereo, he gets in the front seat, he gets in the back seat, he gets out and lies on the trunk, he lies on the hood, and he bought one of these cars that are stupid that talk to you. It's like you turn on the ignition, good morning, you know. I would get rid of that. I'd find the fuse for that and get rid of that in no time. But a talking car. But in any case, so people use inappropriate criteria all the time for making decisions. They either got insufficient data, or the other option is they've got three things: insufficient data, wrong criteria, or they just keep collecting data. And all important decisions are made on the basis of insufficient information, and clarity is the enemy of action, and they just keep going and getting more and more and more, and they never end up acting. Okay, so we need at least three good alternatives, and we need to evaluate and collect data of each of them so we can evaluate them. So the heart of the strategy is the test. Now, every human being on the planet and everyone in this room, everything you've ever done in your life has been done for only one of 6 reasons. That's it. It all boils down to that. It looked right, it sounded right, it felt right, it made sense, or it smelled right or tasted right. That was the only criteria you've ever used for making decisions. So the test is, what are you going to actually evaluate it against? Is it going to be based because it looked right, you bought the car, it sounded right, it felt right? Most people buy cars because they look right or feel right. Or it made sense, you had certain criteria you wanted to use. Most people don't buy cars because they smell right or taste right, but some people are into those things. Some people love the smell of napalm in the morning. It's what starts their day. We thought for those macho people, we should get a aftershave lotion that was based on that smell so they could experience. Okay, so we got the test. The test is always a comparison. It's always in the same rep system. It's always between something that was generated by the operation and some pre-stored criteria, which is what is most uniquely us. This is the sum total of our experience, the sum total of our life that we're going to use to make evaluations against. People that make better decisions have better tests. They've got more experience. They've got more wisdom in order to evaluate the alternatives against. Now, the next part of the decision, and then if we get a match here, then we get the outcome. We buy the car. If we don't get a match, then we usually do one of 3 things. Usually we go back and we either generate more alternatives, we go look at more cars, or we collect more data about them. So we get more data about them till we can finally match our test. Another thing we do is, if all else fails, lower your standards so that we didn't get what we want, but we settle for something else. We settle for something else, and then we can get a match. Or it may be we just kick out of the process altogether and say, I'm never going to find the car or the human being that I want for a mate, so I'm just going to spend my life celibate, and I'll be better off. So it depends on where you go with the thing. So the bottom line is this: think of the strategies you're making. Do you have a hair trigger, or do you delay too long? Do you generate at least 3 good alternatives? Do you collect enough data to get an appropriate evaluation? When you're testing them, are you testing them against appropriate criteria? How much wisdom experience do you bring to evaluating the decisions? And then once that, then do you have to lower your standards, or you're able to raise your standards? What do you do here? And then you go. So this is a simple model that allows you to understand decision making. And when you investigate the decisions you make in your own life, then you begin to see where some of the challenges lie, and will begin to give you some insight into how you can begin to make better decisions, how you can use your mind in order to create the success you want. Notice success over here is, this is a sun with all of the rays coming out of it. That's where you want to get to. So what do you got to do? So when are you going to start? Have you already started? I would hope so. Or are you going to wait? And if so, when? Okay, then. And then what alternatives are you going to come up with? Now, many people are looking for the one straight, secure path to success. If you are, there are at least 100 internet providers out there that will sell you a certain substance in a box, I hesitate to label it, that will give you the one clear, direct path. Obviously, none of those things work. That's the problem. That's why they stink. So therefore, what we need is a series of good alternatives, and there's nothing that says there's got to be one. There may be multiple things that we're going to follow, and we got to collect data to evaluate them. Then we've got to choose one or more, and then we've got to implement them and move forward. Okay, so this is a good model to get you started. Okay, we're going to switch grounds radically. We're going to get a little further out there. We've been kind of moving toward the edge. So, what this is all about is learning to believe impossible things. That's one of the most important skills and abilities you can develop. So, there's this thing called physics. Actually, at one time in my life, when I was younger and more naive, I thought I wanted to be a physicist. So I went off to undergraduate school, and I spent 4 years getting a Bachelor of Science in physics. Now then, classical physics. Classical physics is based on 5 basic ideas. First, reality. The world is objective. It's objectively real. The world out there is real. Second is locality. Locality. Objects can only be influenced through direct contact. That makes sense. Objects can only be influenced through direct contact. Causality. The era of time flows one direction, and cause and effect is a fixed sequence. The cause always precedes the effect. 5, continuity. The fabric of space and time is smooth, continuous. And 5th and last is, given all of this, we've got determination. Things progress in an orderly, predictable way, so we can predict everything if we know all the pieces. This is classical physics. And a lot of physicists spend a lot of time developing and taking these assumptions, expanding on them, exploring what we can do with them. Now, everything was going well, and these classical physics laws and principles seemed to apply pretty well in the world that most of us lived in. But scientists don't necessarily live in the world most of us live in, and so they started looking at 2 ends of the continuum, the very large and the very small. So the very large, you got Einstein and principles of relativity. The very small, as we started taking particles, first we had cells, and then we had them made up of molecules, and then we had them made up of atoms, then we had them made up of protons and neutrons and electrons, and then we started discovering all these other subatomic particles, and we just keep going down and down and down. So once we started doing that, some problems started happening. Some problems started happening. And one of the first problems, and the biggest problem, was that the basic assumption was that a signal from one thing to another, they needed to be touching in some way or connected in some way. And that the fastest a signal could propagate would be at the speed of light. So we could send a signal at the speed of light telling us to change things. And then all of a sudden, this weird thing happened. As they were looking at these subatomic particles, they come up with strange things to describe things like spin and strangeness and other properties that they found they had, which of course they didn't realize were in their mind rather than the thing. But one of the things happened on the way to the circus. is they had these things called spins, and spins were either up or down. And they had certain atoms where the spins were what were called entangled, so that both of them were spin up, both of them were spin down. They separated them. They took them as far apart as they could. And then the amazing thing happened. When one of them switched, instantaneously the other switched. How the hell could this be? How does it know? There's this joke about the boy in school. And so the teacher's saying, well, what do you think the greatest invention ever was? And so people are talking about, well, you know, this and that. And the little boy says, the thermos bottle. And the teacher goes, well, that's interesting. Why do you think the thermos bottle is the greatest invention? And he says, because it keeps hot things hot and cold things cold. And she goes, yeah, so what? And he says, yeah, but how does it know? So the question is, how does it know? How does this spin know to switch when there's no causal connection, there's no direct connection? So this started throwing physics for a complete loop. You see, the problem in physics is this, that if they don't understand it, it can't be, therefore it isn't. If they don't understand it. So it's not enough to have the data, they've got to be able to understand why it works. So this started throwing some monkey wrenches into the machine. So, since locality now is going out the door, because with entanglement, things can be affected at a distance without any physical or energetic connection. Things can be affected at a distance without any physical or energetic connection. Once that goes out, reality as we observe it may not be absolute. Things seem to be changing. And it's not this fixed thing that we wanted it to be. You see, we started off in classical physics. They said, okay, reality is absolute. It's our knowledge of reality that's the problem. It's inadequate. It's insufficient. And because of our ignorance, then that's the problem. And then all of a sudden, now in the new quantum mechanics, it's absolutely switched. It's like knowledge is 100%, but it's the universe itself that is probabilistic. So now, instead of having a relative knowledge of an absolute world, we have an absolute knowledge of a relativistic world. Not good. Reality out the window. Locality out the window. Once they go out the window, then causality goes with them, because it's not since when out of the causality is out, since when the when of events may be changeable and may be affected by our observation of it. That's another thing. So Heisenberg came along and he said, we can look at the thing and you can either measure the momentum or you can tell where it is, but you can't do both simultaneously. There in the uncertainty in momentum times the uncertainty in position is always going to be greater, is always going to be related to h bar. And so that the mere fact of observing it begins to change it. So causality out the door. Now we're beginning to move into la-la land. Continuity. So quantum mechanics said, if we look at the world, it's not smooth and continuous. It's made up of quanta. It's made up of packets. It's discrete. Quantum mechanics says the world is discrete. It's not analog. It's not continuous. And so therefore, continuity is not reliable at the quantum level. Space and time don't appear to be smooth or continuous. Continuity out the door. Now we're really getting into problems. And when we throw all that out, then determination goes out the door. So we can't predict with absolute certainty because the world itself is probabilistic. Now, scientists don't like this, and they're not quite sure what to do about it, because if you accept this, suddenly everything we know can be challenged. Not a good situation. And physicists don't know or understand what to do about it or what it means, because if they don't understand it, it isn't. Now then, let's go a little further. So what if this thing called entanglement, that as far as we know, this entanglement basically relates to atomic particles, but there's beginning to get some increased evidence that entanglement may relate to other things, and that there may be a connection between the mind and other minds, or between the mind and reality. Oh, not good. Physicists don't like this. This is not something they want to hear. Now, of course, they'll say there's limited evidence for this, but we'll talk about evidence in a minute. And then, of course, their label for it is it's speculative. Speculative. So I'm going to tell you about the speculative, and you can make up a decision for yourself. So, now then, there's a book that you would be interested to read that will talk about this. It's a book by Dean Radin, R-A-D-I-N, and it's called Entangled Minds. Okay, so who studies this weird stuff? There's this discipline called parapsychology. And of course, most scientists believe that the para should simply be substituted for a word called pseudo, because it can't be, therefore it isn't. So some interesting things begin to happen. So in 2004, an article in New Scientist, Michael Brooks says, physicists now believe that entanglement between particles exists everywhere, all the time, and have recently found shocking evidence that it affects the wider macroscopic world that we inhabit. So, these so-called pseudo-psychologists have been doing all sorts of these experiments. And in some of these experiments, they begin to find some interesting things. So one of the things is they did what they call Gansfield experiments. So they had two people, and they took a ping pong ball and cut it in half and then stick it over the eyes and shine a light through it. And in a typical Gansfield experiment, ping pong balls are placed over the eyes, white noise is played through the headphones of a person who is the receiver. A receptive state is created in which the conscious mind can relax and receive information. A second person in a different room then attempts to send the receiver information by focusing on him and trying to send him images. The receiver describes his perceptions. Afterwards, the receiver chooses one of 4 targets based on his perceptions. 25% chance, 1 out of 4, of getting it right. Cumulative results over 3,000 sessions in 25 different laboratories around the world resulted in a 34% success rate. But of course, this is pseudoscience, remember. It can't be, therefore it isn't. It must be purely random. The fact that the probability of this happening randomly is 29 million trillion to 1. But don't believe the data, believe the scientists. This is purely random accident. Okay, more researchers recently have started developing other studies that focus on the unconscious physiological systems and try to begin to start sorting some of these things out. And then what happened is, so they set up a system where people started communicating. One person was watching TV and something happened. A person was in another room, tuned into them. And now something further. It was bad enough. It's been bad enough, but it got worse. It got worse because what happened was one element of these experiments that totally was unexplainable, unpredictable, and therefore can't be, obviously, was that the receiver's brain consistently shows a surge in activity and stimulation at around 100 milliseconds before the sender's brain is stimulated. Let's get that again. The receiver gets a signal 100 milliseconds before the sender creates the signal. Now, it's not simply going on subjective thing. I mean, they've got them hooked up to EEG machines, and they can see the spike. So now this really got him upset, because that how the hell can you begin to detect the signal before it happened? The slippage in time has shown up in many other studies working with other unconscious body responses. As these experiments show, the continuity and causality we've come to rely on may not be as reliable as we think. Now, many of us have had experiences. We've had like a gut feeling that something's going to happen, and it happens. We think of somebody and the phone rings. I mean, how do we explain these things? How many people in this room have had one of these experiences? Okay, the evidence is about 80% of the people in the world, except for those few scientists that can't be, therefore it isn't, have these kinds of experiments. They're fairly common. On the way out here on the plane, it was interesting. There was a guy that was a chef, and I'd invited him to contact me, and I told him I would give him some advice. And I hadn't heard from him for about a month. And on the way out here on the plane, they had a TV show, and it was a contest of different chefs, and I thought of him. So what happens? I get here, I go up to my room, I turn on my computer, and what do I get? I get a message from him saying he's now ready to talk to me. So, obviously, accident, nothing to do with. Now then, they even went further. They set up this thing they called, it gets worse, believe me. They set up a thing called the Global Consciousness Project. And it's been studying randomness on a global level since 1998, using random number generators. The idea is to look at randomness, something that is thought to be constant, unchanging part of physical reality, and see if randomness fluctuates in correlation to worldwide events. Let's get that again. There's a certain noise, a certain randomness that occurs, and obviously it couldn't have anything to do with what's going on in the world, because it's purely random, for crying out loud. But these nasty pseudoscientists then started doing some experiments, and they created 65 sites around the world where computers are recording the randomness of electronic noise in resistors and diodes. So it's not involving human beings, it's simply randomness of noise and electrodes and resistors and diodes. Every 5 minutes, the data is collected, and Central Computer in Princeton University. By 2005, they started this in 1998, a total of 185 events of global interest had been correlated to changes in the measurable randomness. Somehow random noise in our physical reality becomes less random when significant human events, natural disasters, celebrations, outbreaks of war, and tragic death occur. So, of course, they looked at 9/11. And what did they find? What did they find? They found that the randomness of the data was affected before the event occurred, several hours before. The change in 9/11, the data peaked around 2 hours before the first jet crashed and returned to normal some 8 hours later. 2 hours before, the randomness changed. Things are getting pretty far out here, and obviously pseudoscience has got out of hand, and science doesn't understand this and can't know what to do with it. So what do we need to do? So in this book, which I recommend, Entangled Minds, Radin proposes we may be living in a gigantic entangled mind. This is speculative, of course. Of course, believing in this kind of reality is not accepted in any scientific circles because it stands much research on its head. Not only can your intention affect other people or things, but your consciousness may be connected to the physical world. Information may flow both directions. Can't be. No, it can't be. Okay, and to explore this theory, we must stretch our beliefs. If you want to stay current with the progress of quantum physics and pseudopsychology research, you have to practice believing what you thought to be impossible. You have to practice believing what you thought to be impossible. Take a moment and think about the time shifting that shows up in these experiments. How is it possible? To explain means there's a cause and effect. The quantum reality of these effects may not be causal. So where do we go? So, you see, you may begin to want to make a shift in your own mind. You want to make a shift. You need to shift from I believe it when I see it to I see it when I believe it. A shift from I believe it when I see it to I see it when I believe it. On a lighter note, one of the movies that's out is Alice in Wonderland, Part 2. And so you might want to take the advice of the Red Queen in Alice in Wonderland. In the conversation between the Red Queen and Alice, "I can't believe that," said Alice. "Can't you?" the Queen said in a pitying tone. "Try again. Take a long breath. Shut your eyes." Alice laughed. "There's no use trying," she said. "One can't believe impossible things." "I dare say you haven't had much practice," said the Queen. "When I was your age, I always did a half hour a day. Why, sometimes I believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast." So one exercise I would recommend for you then is, in addition to the exercise that Evan gave you in the morning, is every morning when you wake up, see if you can suddenly think of 6 impossible things before breakfast. Thank you.
Wyatt and I were having a discussion day before yesterday about the relationship between math, science, and physics. We were discussing how theoretical mathematicians go way out there, and they come up with stuff that the theoretical physicists then try to, tune into their reality and come up with some more imaginary stuff. And then when they come up with something that they go, okay, this seems real, then they go build things like Large Hadron Colliders to find them. You following me here? This is as close to believing it and then seeing it as, we get in the science world. But because it's based on real science and real math, it's a little bit more legitimate or legitimized. So as Wyatt said, we've gone far, far out there. But what we're trying to clue you into here, trying to wake us all up to, is that there are many, many more possibilities than most of us see. There are many, many more possibilities than most of us see. And Wyatt and I have a secret belief, you might call it, even though we believe nothing. A little secret belief that each of us is capable of impossible things. That each of us is capable of impossible things. But the way to manifest these impossible things is not to read a couple of self-help books and write a couple of affirmations, but to take all the best technology that we humans have developed, use it all in concert, leverage whatever gifts and powers we have up through the stack, up through the system, make those little tweaks on the steering system in the autopilot, the little changes in the nav system that will get the jet to the place that we want it to go. And ultimately, we actually have the power to create the whole reality that it's flying in. All right, so we've been dealing with a few different realms: the physical, the emotional, the logical, the internal, the external, kind of the stuff that is going on inside of us, and then kind of the stuff that's happening out there in the environment. The lines are getting blurred here a little bit. On the one hand, we live in a reality that seems to have been created by a few key people throughout history. Aristotle is one of them. Aristotle's logic, that's the underlying foundation of much of our whole system. I mean, Plato, Aristotle, in a way they imagined a reality, they imagined a way that the world works, and then they handed it off, and it propagated and it spread. Very powerful, very powerful. There are others, like Martin Luther King, who've changed reality in other ways for us. Leonardo da Vinci, and a few others around his time. In a very kind of real way, they created a 3D reality for us to live into. Okay, when they kind of formalized perspective. So to some extent, individuals have had a tremendous impact on this thing that we call reality. And we got it from them. They made their visioning of a different way that things could be, and then plugging it into what was happening, made a massive impact. And on the other hand, right, there's nothing as powerful and nothing can stop an idea whose time has come. And somehow these forces seem to be working together. They seem to be dancing. Strikes me that we can manifest as one of those beings, if that's what we want to do. Because each of us can see a reality a little bit better, a little bit more useful, a little bit more beautiful version of reality. But we don't develop that superpower. And we can also, each of us, see ideas whose time has come, and they're ready to be born. They're ready to take root. And we can help them do that. And part of developing this superpower is developing the power of our visioning system, being able to see things that don't exist and see things that are outside of our old ways of seeing things in our mind. So that's why we want to keep practicing this muscle of visioning, the process. It's not just making a vision, it's visioning. It's a new way of approaching reality, new way of dancing with reality. Okay, so take the next exercise, which is this new exercise, which has the 6 boxes. It says visioning in every box. In the lower right corner, write the number 8. So we're on exercise number 8. Now we're going to take what we learned in the last sessions here about perception and about self-deception and also about physics and physical reality, and about the need for the development of the skill of visioning and believing things that don't exist, but not just because, oh, it feels good and, oh, I want to believe in this, I want to make up something because it'll make me feel better, okay? Not the old type, not the chimp deceiving itself and storying so that it doesn't have to feel insecure, but a completely new type. Okay? A new type based on what really could be possible. Okay? Something that when we're really in our highest selves, our most developed selves, in our highest state of awareness and understanding, then taking it all and using this power. So now let's take our first version of visions, which was our last exercise, exercise 7, and let's integrate what we've just learned, and let's use it to reformulate, revision our visions. Okay? So refine and integrate. Refine, integrate, evolve. At least one in each box, at least one. 2 is fine. Make sure you have at least one in every box. Again, remember, we're developing a set of muscles. That's why we're switching from realm to realm. We're going through all of them rapidly, and we're learning to take our old vision, integrate new information, reformulate, revision. So don't get stuck. If you're thinking about it for more than about 5 or 10 seconds, if it's not clear how to refine, reformulate, integrate, move on to the next one and come back. Okay, we're working on working out this muscle so we can just flow with it. And we can use it real time. Don't get stuck in paralysis of analysis or trying to be perfect or, oh no, what if I screw up? Don't worry about that stuff. You can't do this wrong. And again, remember, by the end of this program, you won't recognize any of this stuff anyway. It's just not that important. What's important is you working the muscle. So silence. We'll go for about 5 minutes here. Go. Here's what we're going to do. Quickly, neighbor, 90 seconds apiece. Okay, 90 seconds apiece. Explain what was your insight from this last section and which of your visions did it impact and how? Okay? 90 seconds apiece. Go. All right, who that hasn't shared yet had an insight from this last section? 1, 2, 3. Perfect. Come on up to the mic.
I'm Rob from San Diego. This one I felt was the easiest exercise for me to do from the ones we've done up to date. Instead of focusing on the vision or a thing that is concrete and could be created and was within the realm of possibilities, expanded to the world of possibilities and let impossible be part of my vision, and let that be an acceptable answer on my page. So I didn't limit the bounds of my answers to what I felt was correct or right.
Excellent. What was one of your visions that was impacted by this?
Quite significantly, my logical external became a vision for creating massive value and fundamentally altering the course of humanity. Those are the words that are on my paper.
That sounds like a good one to come up with. Congratulations. Thank you. Thank you. This big world that we live in right now, it seems so complex. There's so many people, and our minds are not, our systems are not designed to deal with more than 100 or 150. Right? So it's just so overwhelming and confusing. It doesn't strike most people, it doesn't occur to us that we could make a difference to the whole thing. It just doesn't occur in a real concrete way. I mean, maybe we go, yeah, I want to make a difference someday, but all the dots don't connect up. Like, here's how this thing could work. And it's a big one to really see that and to really get it. So that's beautiful.
All right, I'm Elizabeth. I'm from Brooklyn, New York. And I have to tell you, I've been really frustrated trying to sit here and rewrite my vision like over and over again.
Yeah.
Because I get, some people, like, the pressure of time kind of kicks things into gear. It tends to make my brain freeze. But this time, I was like, okay, I'm just going to start writing. And I'm glad I did, because I had this really interesting insight thing happen. This idea of seeing impossibilities, right? As an entrepreneur, in order for me to make progress, I have to be able to imagine not take what's in front of me as truth, and sort of act anyway. And I'm pretty used to applying that to, like, goals, like the thing outside of me. So the vision I have of, one of them is to create $4,000 a day in passive revenue. This is like that. I used to see that. I used to think, okay, that's impossible. That can never happen. And now it's like, hell yeah, it can, right? But the idea of implying impossibilities to myself. Like the idea that I will have to become this kind of person. That's like, am I making any sense a little bit?
Yeah.
You know? So like, for example, one of my visions here, and I'm shaking a little because I don't stand up and talk.
Are you outside the
very
comfort zone?
I am outside of my comfort
yeah.
zone. So I've been like doing a ton of personal growth, and as a result, all kinds of crazy ass things are happening, and it's awesome. And all my ladies are falling away. All my girlfriends are falling away. And so one thing that I'm trying to create in my life is a new set of friends, right? New circle. In fact, I'm going to be moving like in 2 minutes. Is not helping, but anyway. So one of my visions that I wrote here was, my inner game is focused perfectly and clean as all get out. That means something to me, you know. I knew who I am, what I do, and what I want. As a result, I effortlessly attract a close-knit circle of powerful, vibrant women who create change on a massive scale. So this idea that my inner game is perfectly focused and as clean as all get out, that to me seems impossible. Now, because there's always more to do, right? And that's fine. Maybe there will be always more to do. But this idea that I can apply the impossibility thinking to myself is something very powerful and, you know, mind-blowing. So thank you.
Nice. So let me ask you something.
I may have to take this out again.
No, it's just real quick. You said get your inner game clean as all get out,
Sure.
so you can attract this community. Yeah.
Yeah.
You might just try on, put the attract the community, and that will be what helps you get the inner game
Yes.
clean.
Right. Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. Again, right? We're thinking another level back, indirect, because that's really more the way it works.
Right.
Okay. Good. Great insight. Excellent. Another example of what? Indirect. Another example of indirect? You'll get plenty of it. Trust me on this one. You will not be able to avoid more of it if you come in this room or listen to this program. Go ahead.
Michael Levitch, Fort Worth, Texas. First, I just want to thank you for the disagreeer thing. That is, I've identified with being a disagreeer for years now, and it's kind of bad in a sense that it's worked for me. Like I've been very successful in a lot of contexts by being that guy. People expect me to be that person.
Yeah.
And my peer group in business and personally has accepted me as that person. And
I don't know about accepted you.
I think they have. I've known, at least they pretend to. Or I
Maybe
imagine
become
them-
excellent at integrating and tolerating it.
I imagine them to accept me for doing that.
Okay, exactly. Is there anyone here that would like to come out of the closet as a compulsive disagreeer? Anyone? Okay, good.
I'm king of it. I mean, it's kind of how I've been
he's the
living.
king.
I am the king.
If anyone
don't
feels like
disagree with me,
they
Al.
might be better, you might want to meet him for the disagreement.
I will beat you down. Yeah, so I didn't realize till you gave that suggestion how limiting that has been for me. It was pretty wild. I was like, wow, I'm really fucking myself over by being that guy. And 20 minutes before that, I was proud of it. Sitting there disagreeing with you and Wyatt, in my head, thinking of how cool I was for disagreeing with you and how I wish I could get up there and argue. And I was like,
just give me a high five, man. That's so good. That's so good.
Yeah, I was fantasizing about how cool it'd be to come and argue and win some argument with you guys. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, what an asshole. So, anyway, I just thank you for that forever, by the way.
If you want to argue with me, I will let you win.
All right, I appreciate it. That's no fun. That's no fun. The winning sucks. Anyway.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, that's why people don't mind arguing with me. So, anyway, back to the last.
Yeah.
The last exercise. So when Wyatt was going through the entangled mind things, I've actually read all that stuff and I disagree with it. That's why it's going to be hard tonight. It's going to be hard.
Yeah.
I think he's making a baseline fallacy and a lot of other errors there, but that's a whole other deal. But at the same time, back to fucking myself for kind of letting myself go, no, and I I do have a habit, I'll look at something and find disconfirming evidence so I can make an accurate decision, because then I blog about it or whatever, and I feel that
Yeah.
I have a responsibility for finding contrary evidence and then trying to leave it up to other people. But anyway, so what it's been doing is limiting me in the logical, internal, is I will disregard some cool techniques that come out, because first I'll go, is there science there? And if there's science there, I'm all in. Like I use some cool brain software, and I'm like, wow, or neurofeedback, I'm into it. But there's some stuff I'm like, photo reading, Paul Scheele, he doesn't know shit. I'm not going to do it.
Right.
And it might be true. And so my vision is to imagine a context where I can go ahead and try that stuff, even if I might not believe it's true, and believe it first, even though somehow silence, whatever that is, go ahead and believe it. So create a vision, a context where I can go ahead and believe it, feel safe, and give some things a real shot that I haven't been giving a shot in the past, is my big take home in there.
Yeah, great. Yeah, great. Congratulations. So we're entering some strange territory here, because I personally think that most of the woo-woo stuff I hear is woo-woo, right? And it's a bunch of idealistic people just making a bunch of things up, and you know, they've got a convincer system where their emotion convinces that it's real, and it's just not, we're not even in the ballpark kind of thing. But what I've discovered is that if I look, I can find contrary evidence on some level to everything. All you got to do is zoom to a different level, right? The scientists and kind of the theorists right now are trying to fit the theory of the very big and the theory of the very small together, and they won't go together. They just won't fit together. And they're guessing, well, we're going to find the unification theory someday. We may. But there's always a contrary perspective. And what I like to, I don't know, one of my favorite little exercises is to remember that the physicists say that inside of an atom, okay, inside of an atom, whatever that means, with the proton, the neutron, electron all spinning around and whirling in this little tornado, that the actual particle, the mass, is so small in there, there's more relative space inside of the atom than there is relative space between the planets in the solar system. And so there's more relative space in there than there is relative space in the solar system. When the astronauts in some of the first missions to space came back, they reported that they would see these little flashes in their eyes. Has anyone ever heard about this? Yeah, they'd see these little flashes, and they didn't know what was going on. So they did a bunch of research, and they looked at their helmets, right, with the electron microscope, and they saw these little tiny holes. And it turned out that cosmic rays, little tiny particles, were actually hitting and going through the helmet, through the suit, and through them, and some of them were hitting their eyes and causing these little flashes. The particles are so small that they can go through the astronaut in space, and it's still okay. But they cause damage. You know, still not good for you. You wouldn't want to go get bombarded by them just to see what it's like to have the eye flashes or anything. There's a lot going on here. So what I noticed myself is I realized I am basically an apparition. I'm as close to a ghost as it gets. Right? There's more relative space in just the atoms, just on that level. I mean, we've got trillions of cells in us, trillions, each made up of molecules and atoms. So we're just like an energy apparition floating around, glued to the planet by a force that no one understands. And if that's not weird enough to just make you doubt anything that anyone says is certain, I don't really know what it is or what is. Now, I don't want to completely unplug everyone from their version of reality. That's not what we're trying to do, is confuse everybody and make everybody like, okay, you know, I need some medication for sure. Even though you know, it's like in the Matrix. Even though I know that this pill isn't real, I'm going to take it anyway because it's going to make the, you know, the angst about nothing being real go away. We don't want to go to that level. Never believe anything too much. Never believe anything too much. There are strategies that we can use to get closer and closer to effectiveness, non-effectiveness, creating the outcome we want, not creating the outcome we want. But really what we're trying to do is not live in the waking nightmare anymore and help others out of the waking nightmare and get more into a waking reality that we can all help each other with less suffering, etc. Right? Just want to like layer that on there. So we're doing some great work, right? We're going to be bringing it home soon.